Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Tahatesh Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Gadai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Murachita Jeva Nahi Buje Keva Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Chaitanya Charit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janibe Rasarariti Shunile Purahoihit Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Bhaktash Chaitanya Charitamrita. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, Shri Raghunath, and Shri Jiva, a graceful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Gaura Leela, from which the very essence of Krishna Leela streams in the 10 directions. Shri Krishna Das Kaviraja Goswami Pad. Again today we will observe ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. And in particular, we'll pick up in the Sanatan Shiksha. We're in Madhya Leela 22. We're discussing the Abhideya Tattva. We've discussed the opening prakaran where bhakti is established as the principal Abhideya of the Shastras. And now we're coming to the second main prakaran of the chapter, where it's explained how a jiva beginninglessly awash in the ocean of samsara becomes a bhakta, follows this Abhideya, and ultimately achieves the ultimate Purushartha of Bhagavad Prem or Krishna Prem. So here we left off with a discussion of the Vaishnava Toshani Tika on a verse from the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, which was cited by Sriman Mahaprabhu in his explanation of how sadhusanga is the principal cause, if you will, or the principal means by which a jiva in samsara who has no bhakti, who has no bhav, or has no awareness of Bhagavan, is what's called bahirmukha, or facing outwards, away from and unaware of Krishna, oblivious of him, if you will. How that jiva can acquire an inclination towards Krishna, or how the jiva can become antarmukhi, or acquire sammukya, which Jiva Gosvami most broadly defined to be the Abhideya, by means of sadhusanga. So last time we discussed the meaning of the word rati in the previous payar and how it, in all likelihood, the intended meaning is moti, and this is affirmed by the mention of variant by Jiva Gosvami himself in his commentary, as well as by the interpretation given in the tippani of the payar. So, having discussed all of that, we came to the verse in the 10th canto where this point is made, and we started the commentary, so we'll finish from the second half of the commentary in this time. And in the first half of the commentary, we heard this important interpretation where Jiva Gosvami takes this statement of reversal of cause and effect as a type of atishayokti or hyperbole meant to emphasize the efficacy of the cause in producing the effect. In other words, because sadhu sangha is so effective in bringing about inclination towards Bhagavan, it's described as if being the effect of inclination towards Bhagavan. So, the other main point mentioned in this verse is that it's not in the commentary, is that it's not ultimately Bhagavan's grace, but the sadhu's grace that makes this all possible. So that's where we pick up today. Is the second, at least in the translation I've given, it's starting from the second paragraph. So I believe everyone's on board, has the file, etc. So I will jump in. Sri Bhagavan raises an objection. Well, without my grace, even the association of the Sat shall not come about. So let that is my grace alone, be considered the original cause of the cessation of worldly existence for a wandering jiva, rather than sadhu sangha. So this is a strong argument when coming from the mouth of Bhagavan himself. If anybody else says it, you might be able to challenge it, but to say that for Bhagavan himself to make this point, you've got to have a strong hand if you're going to reply to this objection. So, Jiva Goswami has no hesitation. He says, to this, you are Sat-gati. So he gives a particular interpretation of this compound Sat-gati, meaning he whose shelter or gati is the Sat alone. So the more conventional interpretation of Sat-gati would be as a Tat-purush compound, meaning that Bhagavan is the shelter of the Sat, or of the sadhus. He's the shelter or the goal of his bhaktas. This would be the more sort of default reading that you might take. But if you instead interpret it as an adjectival compound, or what's called a bahuvrihi compound, then you get this reading of he whose shelter or goti is the Sat. So he states that the Sat are the shelter of even Bhagavan himself. And thus, not Bhagavan or his grace, but rather the Shat should be considered the original cause of the cessation of worldly existence for a jiva wandering therein, since Bhagavan graces a jiva with the association of the Sat, because he himself is the shelter of the Sat, meaning, is in the shelter of the Sat, meaning he himself feels ever obliged to fulfill their wishes, among which are their wishes to give association to and inspire inclination towards Bhagavan in jiva's wandering in samsara. So I know that's a fat note to add off just one little adjectival compound, but to the best of my knowledge, that's what he means to imply. And sometimes, Jiva Gosvami can be a bit terse. So this appears to be a case of that in my view. But if this weren't the implication of him giving this, you could say, alternate interpretation as an adjectival compound, then the whole rest of the commentary wouldn't make sense, and there would be no rebuttal to the objection. So he's, you can say, asking his readers to have a fair, good capability of following his line of thought in this case by simply throwing out this, what you call a vigraha, or this breaking of a compound into adjectival form and expecting the reader to get the whole point of why he's doing that. Anyway, I hope I'm flowing on his wave, if you will. As per the statement of Brahma to Sri Krishna in the beginning of his stuff, quote, your body made up of, or captivated by the wishes of those who are your own. And the statement of Bhagavan himself in the 9th canto, quote, I am completely controlled by my bhaktas. Everything in regard to him proceeds only by the wish of the Sat and not of its own accord. Therefore, even that is your grace, is only following the grace of the Sat. That is, therefore, when you do bestow your grace upon someone, that is only done so following the grace the Sat have already bestowed and wish you to bestow upon the recipient. This is the purport. So I referred to, and for those who have been studying the Sandarbhas, in the Paramatma Sandarbha there's an instance where it's explained that compassion is only evoked when one perceives another undergoing a type of suffering that oneself has also felt. So the Sat are able to bestow grace upon jivas because although they, in Jiva Goswami's view, are now completely free from the miseries of material existence by virtue of having become bhaktas, still they retain the memory of what it's like to be subject to these miseries and not a bhakta of Bhagavan. So although they're not directly experiencing those miseries anymore, since now they perceive that everything that happens in their life and in their world, if you will, is the direct, gracious dispensation of Bhagavan himself, and not merely, the unfolding of karma, still they retain memory of what it's like to suffer in that way, and therefore when they observe others in that condition, they can feel compassion for them, and so wish to grace such persons as well as evoke Bhagavan's grace upon them. So in that sense, he's saying that Bhagavan himself takes no initiative, if you will, because he feels no need to do so, because he can't relate to what those people are going through, because he's just so completely, infinitely blissful. So these bhaktas in samsara, who can relate to the plight of these jivas in ignorance, from time to time when their hearts are so moved, pray to him or evoke his grace upon the jivas, and thereby he becomes inclined at the pull of his Sarup Shakti flowing through the prayers of his bhaktas to bless these jivas. So, moving on. Another objection could be raised that the compound Sadgati presented in the 7th case in the verse as Sadgato means rather the opposite. That is, that Bhagavan is he who is the shelter of the Sat. In response to this anticipated objection, he says, the shelter of the Sat. Even in the case of this meaning of the compound Sadgato. So, in other words, Jiva Gosvami is defending his interpretation of the compound as being adjectival rather than as being a possessive, or being, a bahuvrihi rather than a tatpurush. And so he's giving a reason why, he's already given a line of thought why the adjectival compound has significance, and now he's giving a reason why the tatpurush interpretation has a flaw, and why, therefore, only the other interpretation should stand. So he says, the shelter of the Sat. Even in the case of this meaning of the compound Sadgato, you are not the shelter of the Asat. That is, even if Sadgati is understood to mean that Bhagavan is the shelter of the Sat, the implication of that understanding is that Bhagavan is not the shelter and blesser of the Asat, and thus not the original cause of the cessation of worldly existence for such persons. So, he's saying that, in other words, if you say Bhagavan is the shelter of the sadhus, does that mean he's not the shelter of other people? In this case, he's saying yes. It's meant in a restrictive or a limiting sense that he's not the shelter of those who are not sadhus. So he's not the shelter of the asad, and therefore the asad, those who are devoid of bhakti, devoid of sammukhya, within samsara, they're not sheltered in him, which is to say that they're not objects of his grace, which is thus to say that only the Sat are the source of grace in their life. So this is how he's making his point. This is the purport. Thus, it, that is your grace, proceeds only when caused in the presence of another existent, that is sadhu, by the preceding and earlier preceding sadhus. So it's a bit cryptic the way it's written, but this is what it means. And not rather prior to that, as per the statement in the second chapter of the 10th canto, after having fully crossed over the fearsome and difficult to traverse ocean of material existence and reached the shore themselves, they of abundant affection, or friendliness, meaning the Sat, have left the boat of your lotus feet here for others of the future to take shelter in, and so also reach the shore. Since you are he whose grace is the Sat, alternately, whose grace comes to those in the ocean of material existence only through the Sat. So what he wants to say is that, yes, your grace is part of the process, but the fundamental or the initiating primary element in the unfolding of the process is the grace of the sadhus. Thus, firstly, inclination towards you shall come about only as a result of association with the Sat. This is the point he wants to make. This is the purport. The cause in this regard is indicated by the compound, quote, the master of the higher and the lower, para avara isha. That is, you who are he who is independent of the knowledge and so forth of the higher and the lower. That is, you are he who is not influenced by the mental state of any conditioned being, be it one in a higher or lower set of conditions within samsara. So no amount of knowledge, no amount of worldly qualities or worldly suffering, any of these things can have any direct bearing on he who is so infinitely blissful, he's just not aware of such darkness. Therefore, only as a result of the association of the sadhu, Sri Garga, did even my inclination towards you manifest, by which, as per the manner stated by you in this previous verse, I was previously prayed for profusely by you, I attained you, he who is the grantor of the cessation of worldly existence. This is the purport. So Jiva Gosvami then integrates this with the perspective of the speaker of the verse. In other words, to further fortify the way he's interpreting the verse, he's showing that it's entirely plausible that the speaker of this verse could actually be saying it with this intention because it's corroborated by statements made in relation to his life and his circumstances that are mentioned earlier in the Bhagavatam. So, in short, what he wants to illustrate, and the reason for this whole verse being cited in this part of the Caritamrta, is to give strong stress to the importance and the value of sadhu sangha as being the means by which a jiva in oblivion of Bhagavan within samsara can come in touch with Bhagavan, can acquire awareness of Bhagavan. The conclusions drawn from the verse under discussion in this commentary are also evident in another statement of Akrura, which he made after meeting Sri Krishna in Braja, following his aforecited statement, wherein he muses as to whether he would attain such a fortune. So I'm just adding this to fortify the discussion, which I found quite interesting, is that the previous verse that we discussed last time, of this statement about Akrura, following that statement, then this statement we got today from Muchukunda was discussed, but interestingly, Akrura himself says almost the exact same thing in the course of that earlier set of chapters describing his experience of meeting Bhagavan for the first time in the Bhagavatam. So that this is, not just an isolated statement, but rather that the point being made here in the verse is also consistent with other statements in Bhagavatam and clearly consistent with even the previous evidential verse cited for the concept. I think it makes it appear quite fortified that this is in keeping with what the Bhagavatam teaches. So here we have a verse of Akrura. He says, being such, so by reference to the context, that means, although I am unable to restrict my mind from the pull of the senses upon it towards their various objects, I have approached your feet, which are difficult to attain for the asat. That too, furthermore, I consider your favor, O Isha. When the cessation of samsara shall come about for a person, O you of lotus navel, inclination towards you shall come about as a result of worship of the Sat. And the other reason I decided to include this verse in the discussion, which might be slightly redundant, is that interestingly he uses the word moti, which is the very word that seems to further underscores the idea that although the word rati is found in present-day editions of the Caitanya-caritamrta, in all likelihood the intention is moti, as we discussed last time. So, just a second layer of significance. In any case, there's some nice commentary on this verse. Chakravarti-pad's commentary on this verse succinctly summarizes the progression discussed by Jiva in his commentary on the verse under discussion. So here, Chakravarti-pad refers to the exact same line of thought that Jiva Gosvami is putting in this little bit cryptic, hard-to-follow commentary. He puts it in direct, step-by-step progression of thought in this case. So this makes the whole conclusion of the discussion very clear. So Chakravarti-pad writes the following. Although I am such, that is, although I am unable to restrict my mind from the pull of the senses upon it towards their various objects, I have approached, that is, I have reached, we need the shelter. Oh no, it's okay. I have reached shelter in your feet. That approaching of your feet, furthermore, is difficult to attain for persons who are asat. I consider that it is possible only when your favor comes about. So in other words, he's like many, struggling with his own mind, finding his mind restless due to whatever conditioning there may be from his residual karma within his psyche. And therefore he feels himself unworthy, he feels himself unfit to be blessed with something so spiritually tremendous as the direct darshan of Bhagavan. But nevertheless, he's desirous of it and considers himself to have been highly graced to achieve it. So he thinks that if this is coming about, it could only come about by your grace. So Chakravarti-pad turns this into a conversation. Bhagavan asks Akrura, when shall my favor come about? To that he says, O you of lotus navel, when inclination towards you shall come about as a result of worship of the Sat. So you grace people when they show inclination towards you, and they get that inclination from worshipping sadhus. Bhagavan then asks, when shall worship of the Sat come about? Okay, well then how did they start worshipping sadhus in the first place? To that he says, when the cessation, that is the end time of samsara, shall come about for a person. So here we've got the same little bit strange way of referring to the effect as the cause that we got in the previous verse. So, if Bhagavan then asks, when shall the end time of samsara come about? Well, when does that happen? Then, quote, when the independent or yadrichiki grace of the Sat shall come about is to be understood as the answer. Saying, well, that comes about, and it flips back. In other words, when one gets the association, when one gets the grace of the Sat. Thus, first there is the independent or yadrichiki grace of the Sat, then the beginning of the dissolution of samsara, then worship of the Sat, then inclination towards Krishna. This is the progression. So, very clear, Chakravarti-pad summarizes the whole point. And this language is a little bit cryptic. This word yadrichiki, another place in the Bhagavatam, it's spoken of with an instrumental case as yadrichaya. And I've given it here as independent. It's sometimes also rendered as of its own accord or of independent origin. And the idea is that it doesn't arise as a consequence of the past karma of the jiva. So this is what makes it independent, in other words, or what makes it special, is that unlike everything else that happens to any given jiva as an unfolding of its karma, because these sadhus are not moving as fellow, what do you want to call them, prisoners or fellow swimmers in the network of the cycling of karma back and forth, then the way that they're willing or wishing to act is coming from a sphere of causation outside of that closed system, if you will. So in that respect, it's called independent, or it's called coming of its own accord. So when that somehow comes about, such as, a famous case would be in the Bhagavatam, how Manigriv and Nalakubar are drunk, skinny dipping in the, pride of their wealth, and Narad Goswami walks by. And not only walks by, catches them doing what they're doing, and then decides to bless/curse them. So what motivated Narad to do that? Why did Narad end up there at that time? It's not considered to be an outcome of mere karma. It's considered to be something that happened by the free movement of a bhakta such as Narad, and by the gracious disposition that he fosters even towards, outlandish youngsters. So, just as an example. So, a couple more points left here. Sri Jiva Pod also confirms, in regard to this verse that we just discussed, that the quote cessation of samsara refers to the sensation of the inclination for that, and explains that inclination, mati, towards Sri Bhagavan, and moreover bhakti to Bhagavan, can come about only when one's inclination towards samsara has diminished as a result of service to the Sat. So this is an interesting point. The exact phrase here is samsara apavarga. So the word apavarga has different meanings, but in this context it means reaching the final stage, or as the pavarga is the last of the 5 sets of consonants, or standard, the 5 initial types of consonants, then the apavarga, means coming to the final portion of, or the final stage of something. So when does that happen? Tad vasana kshoy. When the inclination for it stops. In other words, what this implies is that you're in samsara as long as your mind is conditioned to be interested in it. So you start to come out of samsara as soon as the inclination towards being a part of it, be it a happy member or an unhappy member, be it a positively contributing member or a negatively contributing member, be it as, a wonderful person who will go down in history as having vastly contributed to human society, or as another person who blows away into the dust and is never known ever again by anyone. Regardless of whatever role you play, regardless of whatever situation you may have within the world, unless and until the inclination to be any type of part of it wanes, then there's no scope of coming out of it. So it's only by the acquisition of a vasana, or of, a congealed, impressioning of the psyche such that the mind naturally gravitates towards an object, if we want to loosely characterize the idea of a vasana like that. Unless there's a vasana for something not of the world, one will never have any experience of anything that's not of the world. And one will not come towards, so to speak, the shore of the ocean, so to speak, of samsara, without this vasana for samsara waning. The well-known opening prayer of Thakur Mahashai's Prarthana, he says, Sangsar vasana mor kabe tucha hobe, Vishaya chariya kabe shuddha hobe man. He says, when will my mind be pure? When will I give up these objects of the senses or this mundane experience? But fundamentally, before he prays for that, he says, when will this vasana of mine for samsara become insignificant? Or when will it wane to such an extent that it has no influence over me? So this is, this is what could be referred to as chitta shuddhi, or the purification of the psyche, that waning of the vasana for samsara. So here, what Jiva Gosvami is saying is that this whole idea of crossing the ocean of samsara or transcending samsara, it's not a physical thing. You don't need to fly here or climb this mountain or go across this ocean or anything like that. You need to do whatever it is that results in the mind getting reconditioned like this. That's all it boils down to. And once that is possible, once the predominating vasana within the psyche is not something related to the world, then tvayimoti, or inclination towards you, can flourish, can come about in the mind. So there's no two ways about it. It's not that you can have great desire for X and great desire for Y. It's not that you can, so to speak, have your cake and eat it too, although it's not fair to call it cake in this case, because that would compare Bhagavan to things of the world. So in other words, these things are mutually exclusive. Anyway, this is how Jiva Gosvami stresses the point, which is, I felt very apt because of the metaphor here of Akrura and the metaphor given in the Payars of the river of time, and how these things are, visually depicted, and how that only comes about by this shift in inclination, or this shift in the conditioning of the psyche. And that comes about, how does that shifting come about? It comes about by sadhu sangha. It comes about by engaging in service to the sadhus, and engaging in the worship of Bhagavan as per their inspiration and direction, such that there's a shift in one's attitudes. So this is the point thus far. So the last 2-3 payars, the last 2-3 citations, is all basically boiled down to this. The jiva starts to acquire connection with the abhideya of the Shastra by means of sadhu sangha. So then we come to the next statement, the file might run out here. Let me just check. Did I put the next verse in there or no? Oh no, it finishes there. Oops. Okay. Well, sorry about that. I thought it had one more piece in it. Okay, I got a quick solution. One sec. Rather than taking your time to make a new file, just check out this link. So, there's one payar, and then he cites the next verse in Bhagavatam. So that's what we'll discuss. So the payar you don't have, I'll just read it to you. Do your best, and then we'll can see all the verse and the tikas in that link. So he says, Krishna jadi kripa kore kono bhagyavane guru antarjami rupe shikhaya apane. If Krishna graces someone fortunate, he himself teaches them in the form of the guru and the inner regulator, or the antarjami, which is sometimes considered synonymous with the Paramatma. So, the flow of thought here is that this progression was made, which was nicely summarized by Chakravarti Pad. There is, independently one acquires grace of sadhus. That starts to bring about the dissolution of one's entanglement in samsara. Then gradually one respects sadhus, worships sadhus, follows sadhus, and then under the influence of that regard for sadhus and application of their guidance, one starts to acquire inclination for Krishna. And as one acquires inclination for Krishna, and as the sadhus may evoke Krishna's grace upon that fortunate person, then this happens. if Krishna graces someone fortunate, or then Krishna may take direct initiative in the destiny of that jiva, then it says that he himself teaches them in the form of the guru and the form of the antarjami. So, then this verse in the Bhagavatam, which is given there in that link, is cited as the evidence for this point. So this verse is also comes up in the opening chapter of the Caitanya-caritamrta, and there's some important points made in regard to that, but they're mostly based on the commentaries on this verse. So I thought this verse is definitely worth giving some attention to. It's worth looking at the commentaries because it's very central also to the line of thought of Jiva Gosvami that he preserves, if you will, throughout the Sandarbhas of the Advaya Gyan Tattva, or seeing the oneness element of all of these different self-same manifestations of Bhagavan as Paramatma, as Bhagavan himself, as Brahman, as Sarup Shakti, as Jiva Shakti, as Maya Shakti, etc. So also as the Guru, as the manifestation of the Guru within the mind, these are also considered self-manifestations of Bhagavan in the life of the Jiva. And as when we get around to teaching the first chapter of the Charitamrita, this point is also stressed greatly by Kaviraja Goswami in how he introduces the whole subject matter. So this verse in the Bhagavatam illustrates the point nicely. So it says this: Naivopayam tyapatichim kavayastavesha Brahma yushapi krita ridhamudha smaranta Yontar bahis tanubritam ashubham vidunvan acharya chaitya vapusha swagatim vyanakti. So this is Uddhava speaking to Krishna. O Isha, abounding with joy, remembering the accomplishment of you who with your form situated in the citta, and form as the acharya, internally and externally, dispel inauspiciousness, and make your own state, and manifest your own state for the embodied. The wise do not attain acquittance of their debt to you, even within the lifespan of Brahma. So I know that phrase, manifest your own state, sounds a bit vague, but I left it that way because the commentators give different viewpoints on it, and the word gati is itself a rather vague word. So I left it intentionally vague so that the significance of the individual commentators' viewpoints would be more vivid. So first we'll look at the Bhavartha-dipika of Sridhara Samipad. He reads the context like this: let alone mention of other worship, that is, engaging in further worship of you, requital of the favor shown by you shall occur only by means of offering oneself to you, and not otherwise. So in other words, Uddhava is really speaking strongly here. This is the last of 6 verses he speaks near the very end of the Uddhava Gita, where he's expressing profound appreciation for all of these teachings that he's received in the course of this dialogue known as the Uddhava Gita. And so he's saying that, it's never that we could just worship you to appease ourselves of debt to you. Like, oh, you did me a favor? Yeah, I'll do you a favor as well. Or, yeah, you really helped me. So eventually I'll definitely be able to, help you just as much. He's thinking it's impossible that we could ever come close to reciprocating fully with the extent of favor that we've received from you. So because there's no scope of ever performing enough worship to appease our debt to you for an eternity, the only honorable thing we could do is simply offer ourselves to you as an indication of the extent of the appreciation and regard that we feel for the benefit that we have received. This is Samipad's way of seeing it, the context. So in that spirit, Uddhava speaks the verse. Abounding with joy, that is, abounding with supreme bliss, remembering your accomplishment, that is favor, The wise, that is, even knowers of Brahman, do not attain acquittance, that is, requital, meaning specifically acquittal of debt to you. So, from Swamipad's perspective, that's also a very strong point, because for many, once one acquires knowledge of Brahman, then karma, all of this becomes dissolved. So what this implies is that even if one has completely transcended karma, one is no longer any quote-unquote karmic debt or involvement, this favor shown by Bhagavan is completely outside of that give and take, cycle of exchange known as karma. So none of that, or being free from that, doesn't have any bearing on reciprocating with or showing something of equal merit to the favor shown by Bhagavan. So then what is this favor that Bhagavan shows that is so wonderfully great that you can never get out of debt for having gotten it? In the second half of the verse, he describes the favor. Specifically, you who, with your external form as the acharya, that is, form as the guru, and internal form situated in the citta, that is, form as the inner regulator, dispel inauspiciousness, that is, the inclination towards the objects of the senses, and manifest your own state, that is, your own form. You reveal yourself to your bhakta. So what's interesting here is Swamipad's interpretation of inauspiciousness is identical to Jiva Gosvami's interpretation of how someone, becomes freed from samsara. In other words, that tad vasana kshoy that we just read, here it's directly, that exact same point is made, where the inauspiciousness that Bhagavan frees you from is that vasana. So in other words, none of the world's inauspiciousness is actually the inauspiciousness. The actual inauspiciousness is the mind's inclination or preoccupation with all of that inauspiciousness, or so-called auspiciousness, depending on whether it's a form of dvesh or rag, whatever the case may be. In either case, both are meant to be left behind. So inauspiciousness is defined as an inclination towards vishay of any variety. So the grace of the guru and the grace of what is elsewhere in the Caitanya-caritamrta referred to as the shiksha guru form of the antarjami or of the paramatma, is that they remove that vasana. And moreover, that they manifest perception of Bhagavan. So they remove the vasana for the negative, and they bring about the vasana for the positive, whereby one can have perception. And we'll be generous and say, and of course it'll be a joyful perception of Bhagavan, and since no perception of something can be joyful without previously having acquired a sense of ruchi, or a sense of taste and a vasana for that thing, the implication is that there's, Bhagavat spriha, or a desire of a vasana for Bhagavan manifested into the citta by the Guru, which is precisely what Rupa Gosvami teaches in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So we'll say that that's implied in what Swamipad is saying. Okay, so now let's look at Jivapad's Tika. He says, Krishna raises a question. Well, why does one reject even those results? That is, the forms of worldly enjoyment and the moksha that I offer my worshippers, and not rather reject me? What have I done to merit never being forsaken by my bhaktas, who instead forsake everything of the world and even moksha for the sake of attaining me? To this, Uddhava says, Naiva, he speaks this verse, O Isha, the wise, the all-knowing, abounding with joy, that is abounding with the supreme bliss of bhakti to you, remembering your accomplishment, that is, favor upon them, do not attain acquittance, that is, do not see any possibility of requital, meaning specifically acquittal of debt to you, even within a lifespan equal to Brahma's, meaning even by worshipping you for that length of time. Thus, no one can reject you was stated in the previous verse. So, in the previous verse, Uddhava made this remark, that no one could ever reject you. So that's where Jiva Goswami is getting his line of thought for the context of the statement, where if Uddhava said, no one can reject you, then Bhagavan says, well, why not? I give all these highly desirable things, why don't people just take them and leave me behind? So then Uddhava is saying, no one can do that because they feel indebted to you, so indebted to you that they could never repay that debt even if they went on paying it till the end of time. So what was this wonderful favor that you showed that left them feeling so indebted? He describes the accomplishment of Bhagavan, which his bhaktas feel they can never repay. You who with your external form as the acharya, that is, form as the guru, an internal form situated in the citta, that is, form manifest in the citta, that is able to be meditated upon, dispel inauspiciousness, that is, everything impending of bhakti to you, and manifest your own state, that is, experience of yourself, for the embodied, that is, for some among the embodied who are successful bearers of a body or embodied beings by virtue of their being recipients of your grace. So Jiva Goswami's interpretation is a little bit different, and in this case I believe that his interpretation of the word chaitya is not the intended interpretation here in the Caitanya-caritamrta. Not that it's contrary or problematic, it's also complementary and appreciable, but in the context of why the verse is being cited here, where the purpose of the citation is to emphasize the idea that Bhagavan is teaching in the form of the Paramatma, then to interpret this idea of the presence of Bhagavan within the citta as an object of meditation, rather than a functional expression of Bhagavan that's leading to the acquisition of understanding, that would be a different viewpoint. So I left it in here just because I thought it's worth reflecting on, and it's also a valuable understanding of the verse, but it's not, I think, directly what is referent to the line of thought in this passage in the Caritamrta. So file that in your in your context notes. And Chakravarti Pad, he, oh no, line dropping.
Recording in progress.
Okay, sorry about that. Looked like my line dropped for a minute. So we'll read lastly Chakravarti Pad's tika on this verse. He says, if Krishna raises the objection, well, because of my being a bestower of all desired purusharthas upon persons who worship me, my giving of those purusharthas to them is not unconditional, and rather is only conditional. To that, he says, no, it's not like that. So in the previous verse, Uddhava praised him as being a great unconditional benefactor. So then Krishna's giving an objection to that and saying, well, I'm only giving benefit to the people who worship me, so that doesn't make me unconditional. So now he's proving that Bhagavan's favor of the jiva is unconditional. And there goes the line again. Oh dear.
Recording in progress.
Okay, I'll keep trying here. Hopefully the line will stay. He says, even the worship of you being performed by them, furthermore, is only given to them by you. Thus, people certainly do not attain acquittance, that is, requital, meaning specifically acquittal of debt, to you, by means of attendant service to you, the unconditional provisioner of supreme benefit, or of the highest good, spanning or continued for a duration even of thousands of great kalpas. So, he's taking the idea here. Bummer. This class is wrecked by the internet.
Recording in progress.
So thus Uddhava speaks this verse, abounding with joy, that is abounding with supreme bliss, remembering your accomplishment, that is favor, the wise, that is the discerning, do not attain quittance, that is requital, meaning specifically acquittal of debt to you, even within the lifespan of Brahma. In the second half of the verse, he describes the favor shown by Bhagavan specifically. You who externally favor the embodied...
Recording in progress.
You who externally favor the embodied with instruction in the mantra related to yourself and bhakti to yourself in the form of the acharya, that is the mantra guru and shiksha guru, and internally prompt functions or vrittis, cognitions, in the intellect that cause attainment of yourself, as per your statement in the Gita 10.10, I give the means of understanding by which they reach me. And thus you cause enactment of worship of yourself and manifest your own state. That is, you grant your worshippers the state, the nature of which is being an associate of yours, possessed of prema. So what's very significant here is Chakravarti Pad's interpretation of the Chaitya Guru function. So he explains that, or he clarifies that, by saying that Bhagavan acts as the Shiksha Guru, form as the Chaitya Guru, by
Recording in progress.
bringing about or inspiring vrittis in the chitta, or simply you could say thoughts, that lead to one actually meaningfully understanding Bhagavan, meaningfully or aptly worshipping Bhagavan, and ultimately reaching Bhagavan, achieving prema, becoming his associate. So this idea is something that gets more discussion in the first chapter of the Adi Lila in the Caritamrta. So I'll just give like a snippet of the commentary that's found there, verbally here. So in the Caritamrta, in the first chapter, the opening verse, actually the two first words of the entire text are Bande Gurun. I offer obeisance to the gurus. So then that's explained to mean the mantra guru and the shiksha guru. And then the shiksha guru is said to have two forms. The bhakta shrestha, or the best of the bhaktas, and the antarjami.
Recording in progress.
Sorry about this line constantly dropping. I'm sure it's difficult to follow this class. I don't know why it's happening today. We've had generally smooth internet. And now I'm trying to explain a pretty technical point, so I don't know if it'll go over. I'll try one more time, otherwise I'll quit and share it next time. So what I'm trying to explain is the Caritamrita's view on the meaning of the Chaitya Guru, or the meaning of what's called the antarjami in the text. So the Caritamrta mentions two fundamental categories of guru, the Diksha Guru and the Shiksha Guru. Then it mentions that there are two divisions of Shiksha Guru, or two categories of Shiksha Guru. One is they call the Bhakta Shrestha, and later the word Mahanta is also used. So Mahanta, Bhakta Shrestha, the praman cited for those two words is, guess what? The exact verse that we're discussing now. So what's the word in the verse we're discussing now? Acharya. So, and what do the commentators say? It means the guru who teaches the mantra, the guru who teaches how to do bhakti. So in that context, the Bhakta Shrestha and the Mahanta simply refer to the embodied guru who gives the mantra and who teaches the path of bhakti. So that's one category of Shiksha Guru. Now the point of discussion is the type of Shiksha Guru who's called, quote, antarjami, or the inner regulator or indwelling regulator. And what's complicated about this is that the word antarjami is commonly used as a synonym for the word paramatma. So the paramatma is in many cases simply spoken of as the antarjami. So many interpret this section of the Caitanya-caritamrta to mean that the Paramatma in the general sense, or the conventional sense, is what's referred to as the Chaitya Guru, or the form of the Shiksha Guru in that payar. So, my understanding is that that's not the intended sense. And the reason for that comes to us from the second verse that's cited as praman for this point in the first chapter of the Adi Lila. So today, this verse in the Bhagavatam that we're reading, you can see how Chakravarti Pad interpreted the verse when he's talking about the Chaitya Guru form, or the Chaitya Vapu of Bhagavan, as being someone who is causing particular types of cognition in the mind of the bhakta. So that's an active function. It's not just a passive allowance for thought to function or the psyche to be maintained in the conventional manner. That's an intervening initiative being taken by Bhagavan in the form of inspiring particular vrittis or particular thoughts or particular cognitions in the mind of this bhakta. So the second verse that's cited as praman for this antarjami shiksha guru element is the famous verse that Chakravarti Pad just quoted in this tika right here. And as you can see, these things, and when these commentators choose to quote what they quote, it's all very part of a web of texts that when you study them all intertextually, becomes very clear what are the main threads going on here. So the 10th verse of the Gita, as it was half quoted in that commentary of Chakravarti Pad, says, Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pritipurvakam dadami buddhi yogam tam yenamam upayanti te. That I give this buddhi yoga, or this means of understanding, by which people can come to me. So who does Bhagavan give that to? He says, Satata yuktanam, those who are always intent upon me, and bhajatam pritipurvakam, those who are worshipping me lovingly. So that's a unique category. In other words, that's not all jivas in samsara. That's a very, very small group of jivas in samsara that are so blessed to have already had sadhu sangha, already become acquainted with the path of bhakti, already be practicing the path of bhakti, such that they're in an advanced state on that path. And it's to those persons that this antarjami is being said to give this type of cognition in the mind. So, in the following verse of the Gita, it becomes even more explicit, these are the third and the fourth of the famous, what they call chatushloki of the Gita, or the 4 verses that convey the essence of the entire teaching of the Gita. So the following verse says, Tesham eva anukamparta, where Bhagavan says, to give grace specifically or only to them, meaning to those persons who worship me with love, which the commentators say means bhaktas. So this is describing something that Bhagavan only does for bhaktas. So the idea that that this is just the Paramatma in general becomes contradicted when the praman for what this quote-unquote Paramatma is doing is something that Bhagavan is only doing actively for bhaktas. So what does he do? Says, Tesham evanukam partam aham jnanajam tamaha, that there is this darkness born of ignorance, and atma bhavasto nashayami jnana dipena bhasvata. With the shining lamp of knowledge, I cause the destruction of this darkness of ignorance. And how do I do that? He says, atma bhavasta. I do that situated in the bhav of the atma. So here, bhav, cryptic term, atma, cryptic term. Let's go to the commentary. So, what did the commentators say? They explain it exactly as Chakravarti Pad just explained this verse in the 11th canto. That Bhagavan causes particular vrittis to arise in the chitta of those bhaktas. So this is a function that Bhagavan only does for bhaktas by actively giving rise to particular vrittis in their mind. And then Chakravarti Pad adds a purport and says, this is something that's given only by Bhagavan and something that can be grasped only by that specific recipient that Bhagavan dictates it to. In other words, it's not like words in a book or even words that a guru says to a group of students that anyone can hear and acquire an idea from. It's a specific manifestation of a particular state of consciousness in the mind that's like downloaded only to that device. It's like on, Wi-Fi password lock or whatever analogy you want, where the only person who gets it is the intended recipient and nobody else. It's encrypted, so to speak. So I mention all these points just to emphasize this idea that this concept of Chaitya Guru, or of what's called the Antarjami here, is not a passive thing that's accessible to everyone, but rather is an active, interested function of Bhagavan that becomes manifest in reciprocation with the intensity of the bhakti, the intensity of the intentness upon him of the bhakta, such that that person acquires a special state of awareness or a special state of understanding caused by this, influence of Bhagavan directly within the psyche itself. So in other words, it's not words, it's not statements, it's not anything that is an object of cognition, it's rather how those things are then cognized. It's a manner of grasping them or a manner of understanding them such that one comes to then perceive Bhagavan in truth or in a more profound manner, or in a, what Jiva Gosvami here called to have direct experience of Bhagavan. So in that sense, then I'm giving all these points to, in other words, establish an interpretation that this concept of Antarjami as a Shiksha Guru is not a generic concept, but a very specific concept which is explained by Bhagavan himself in the Chatushloki of the Gita, of all places. And in that respect is what is alluded to in this verse in the Bhagavatam that we're discussing now as this Chaitya Vapu. And that is one of these two forms in the Payara we're discussing that Krishna assumes to teach or reveal himself to bhaktas when he so wishes, after such persons have received grace from sadhus. So, I'll stop here. I'm a little over time, and I apologize for the poor connectivity and also for the incomplete file today. I hope it was possible to follow the main points. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, complaints, or anything else, feel free to share. Yes.
Pranam Shri Krishna Dasa. I have a question on the related to the very last paragraph in the file. So it's the one that summarizes Jiva Goswami's commentary on Srimad Bhagavatam 10.40.28.
Okay.
So I was very struck with this idea that for Jivatmans who are going around in samsara, there'll be different predominant vasanas at different times, so Jivatmans, they get into all sorts of things. They may get into becoming wealthy, they may get into mundane scholarship, they may get into, yogic cities, or all sorts of things, and they're just kind of going around to different ones. But then, as a result of service to the sat, eventually the predominant vasana will come to be a vasana not of the world, but rather a vasana for Bhagavan. And I found that very a good summary I found that very interesting and something to think about. Now I had a particular question on it, which is generally do Jivatmans only successfully perform Sharanagati to Bhagavan after their predominant vasana has become for Bhagavan? Or in some cases, do Jivatmans successfully perform Sharanagati even while their predominant vasana is for the world? Is that even logically or psychologically possible?
Can be said in both ways. As we discussed related to that verse that came earlier in the chapter, Sakrideva Prapanojas Tavosmiti Tuyachate, that if someone even once says, "Oh Bhagavan, I'm yours, I vow to grant that person fearlessness forever. We read this statement earlier in this chapter. Oh, bummer.
Recording in progress.
You
Sorry.
cut out there for a moment.
Okay.
I caught the point up to vowing to grant the person fearlessness, but I didn't get anything after that.
Okay, so that statement came earlier in the chapter, and
Yeah.
the opening word of the verse is Sukrit, once. So the commentators say that one acceptable interpretation is the fact or the situation of someone literally just saying it once. In other words, maybe they have 99% samsara vasana caked in their head. Okay? But
Yeah.
somehow, by some sadhu sangha, by some bhakti-abhas, whatever, they got this little 1% inkling of knowledge and interest in Bhagavan. And somehow, on that limb of that 1% of inclination, they make this remark. Suppose, then that statement, that expression, will evoke some grace of Bhagavan upon them. Bhagavan will now vow to protect that person, which means he'll now see to bring about the nutriments required for that person. Man, this net keeps dropping. This is frustrating.
Recording in progress.
Sorry, friend. So I'll try one more time here.
Okay.
No
worries.
Bhagavan will now take the initiative to provide what is needed for that bhakta to become free from danger, so to speak. In other words, to come to him. So if that bhakta, receiving what is required from Bhagavan, makes good use of it, then the purification of their psyche will be completed, they will reach Bhagavan, and their statement will prove true. In other words, this is like the ideal simplified idea of the whole process. So it's possible like that. But the reality of, the vast majority of people is that they have past aparad. And as a result of that past aparad, no matter how many times they sing so beautifully for the Thakur, and no matter how many times they pray with all muster, they turn around 5 minutes later, 1 day later, and go do things that are antithetical to the things they just prayed. Because their vasana for variety X, Y, and Z of mundanity, be it pious or impious or what have you, is still very strong. This is the messy reality of trying to follow the path of bhakti for most people, whose brains are, so to speak, scrambled by all these different inclinations for all these different features of samsara. So that person's life is not going to look well organized. Or in other words, on the one hand, they're spending 1 hour a day saying, this is my one and only true goal and aim and sincere desire, and then flipped, and then they're going and acting the opposite of that 23 hours a day. And then the next day again, oh no, this, yes. And, you might say this guy's a hypocrite. But from a more generous perspective, you can say, at least he's trying. In other words, you got to start somewhere, and it's not like you can just snap off all these other vasanas that you have that are embedded in your psyche from beginningless time. There's going to be this period, and Bhagavan himself talks about it in the Bhagavatam. He himself directly speaks to this condition. He says, Veda dugatmakan kaman parityage pyanishvara. And he makes the statement that these people, they have full knowledge of the self-defeating, suffering-causing consequences of their actions based on their worldly attachments, and still they don't give them up. Not only do they can't. Bhagavan speaks of them as unable to give up their attachments, unable to overcome these vasanas. I mean, this is not like a new problem. Bhagavan knows the psyche of these people like way better than they do. So what does he tell these people? You know, he tells them, keep trying. He tells them to keep doing it, to keep practicing, despite the fact that they keep slipping back into acting upon these other vasanas that in the interim are still more predominant in their mind. And that gradually, by that, you know, force or by that effort, and by putting more and more time, gradually absorbing the mind more and more in what nourishes the bhakti vasana, gradually you're going to get a shift in the demographic, if you will, of your, you know, like, I mean, if you put it, like, if you compare it to politics, suppose somebody starts like a new political party, and they, you know, started in their little village, and then they, you know, get some followers in their village, and then they start in their little town, and then, you know, little by little they're in their state, and little by little they exert their influence to the point where eventually they might have a majority, and therefore dictate the policy of the whole whatever region or country that they're in. It doesn't happen immediately, but gradually, by the efforts that they make, they acquire more and more influence. So similarly, if you think of like vasanas as like these different, you know, like, what do you call those? I can't, like lobbying groups, if you will, you know, that are like panning for the, you know, if the national budget is like the attention of the psyche, then there's all these vying interests trying to acquire, you know, resources to produce their actions. So by, you know, gradually acquiring more and more attention and acquiring, therefore getting more and more power, getting more and more fortified, having more and more influence, eventually they can get the critical mass where they're the most powerful. And then once they're the most powerful, bhakti it becomes easier to do bhakti than not do bhakti. It becomes more, quote, natural or comfortable or fun or easy or the first-hand inclination that one will have to do those activities rather than anything else. Until that critical mass is reached, it might feel the opposite. It might feel like one has to use discipline, one has to set reminders, one has to, whatever, you know, seek out inspiration, all these other things, you know. This is all symptomatic of where the condition of the psyche is at a given stage. So, you know, depending on how you look at it, it can appear that yes, this person once said, I surrender to you, and gradually it came true. So it is like that. But from another perspective, or the second perspective that I'm alluding to, truly speaking, no one surrenders or like completely remains uninterruptedly absorbed only in awareness of Bhagavan in his shelter and his seva, unless and until the psyche is completely purified. How could it be otherwise? You know, but nevertheless, Jiva Gosvami describes Sharanagati as something preliminary to engagement on the path of bhakti. So, you know, the implication is that it's taken up, or it's, loosely speaking, like practiced, even by a person who isn't truly or fully practicing it. In other words, it's what's enabling the person to enter into, to become recognized as, or to conceive of themselves as belonging to Bhagavan as a bhakta, and then gradually actually bring that into a reality through following the path of sadhana and receiving all of the purifying influence that comes in the wake of that. So, does that give you some useful framework to think about?
Yes, it does. It does. Yeah, I think it's very practical too. Yeah, no, that helps me understand better. Yeah. So I mean, and it's also good. I mean, I don't have to wait to try to perform Sharanagati until my until my predominant, because I don't think my predominant vasana at the moment is for Bhagavan. I think it's for something else. So that's good. I can attempt to perform Sharanagati now. I mean, I already have made some attempts. I don't know if they've been very successful, but so one can attempt to perform Sharanagati, and then that can be an aid to the process of bhajana and other bhakti-related practices that then help the Sharanagati to become complete in the end after a long time.
Yep, Jiva Goswami's statement is tadiyatva siddhe, that without Sharanagati, one is not accepted as his own. Or in other words, Bhagavan doesn't consider anyone his bhakta if fundamentally they're not a Sharanagata. And it's a Sharanagata who can take shelter in a guru, who can take up the path of bhakti, who can engage in kirtan, in smaran, in puja, etc., etc., etc. If there isn't a fundamental foundation of Sharanagati under that, then it's either what Jiva Goswami calls a svarta kriya vishesh, some means of fulfilling some purpose of your own, using bhakti culture as a means, or it's just someone doesn't know what they're doing. So Sharanagati is given very great stress by our Goswamis and is most fundamental to the entirety of the bhakti path.
Hare Krishna, Babaji. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. It's about my doubt is about the famous verse Anyabilashita Sunyam Dhyana Karma Dhyanavritam. So the bhakti is considered to be effective when the practitioner has abandoned or is not recovered by any jnana or karma, or even not making a kind of mixed bhakti like karma mishra bhakti. So at what point can we consider that the bhakti is a beginning in the life of a practitioner? At what point can he consider that the bhakti is part of his life?
One way it can be conceived is when you meet a bhakta, along the lines of what we discussed today in the Caitanya-caritamrta. In another sense, it can be when one takes up the practice of bhakti as taught in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So that is Tasmad Gurum Prapadyeta, or that beginning with taking shelter at the feet of the Guru, one actively engages in following these steps or these processes. That's another way it's defined. Another sense is that the extent to which Shraddha has been acquired, this is how one way Rupa Goswami gives as the first stage in the self-manifestation of Shraddha. By hearing Shastra from sadhus, one acquires Shraddha. On the basis of that Shraddha, one takes shelter in a guru as a teacher of bhajan, and then one receives diksha, receives education, training in how to do the practices of bhakti. So there's different ways that the quote-unquote starting point can be defined.
Yes, and the one who can really witness that the bhakti has begun, is it only the guru, or the association of other sadhus or any other practitioner? How can one be sure that actually he is on the path of bhakti?
As far as the path in a general sense, the path is defined. For us who follow the teachings of Rupa Goswami, we follow the path of bhakti that he taught in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So, one can understand if one is following that path, if one is doing the activities, then following the process described in the book. That shouldn't be like a mystical, crazy idea. There should be like a very formulaic notion of like, yes, these are stages, and yes, I've done X and I'm yet to do Y. There's a level like that. There's a level that should be very clear and solid in terms of what is its conceptual nature. What are these activities, and they're all crisply defined, and one can intellectually have a strong understanding of whether one is doing what is defined or not. But in addition to that, in terms of the extent to which the psyche is purified, or the extent to which one has, bhava bhakti has become self-manifest in the citta, the extent to which one's anartas have been purged, that bit can be much more challenging. Or in other words, there can be, blind spots in our own self-perception where varieties of anartas may lurk, or loom largely, that are visible to others but perhaps less visible to ourselves. And in that case, the guru or the association of other, good Vaishnavas will be indispensable in acquiring, or balancing our self-understanding about where we are in the process of purification and what we will do well to continue working on. So there's a conceptual general structure that should be very clear, but then there are subtleties which definitely require support and guidance to work through.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Babaji.
All right, well, that looks like it for today. So we'll sign off here. And in the next discussion, we'll look at some of these points that we just came to now, how from this association with sadhus, from this gracious self-teaching by Krishna of himself in the form of the Antarjami and in the form of the Guru, how one acquires Shraddha, and how this enters one's life through or what are the elements that lead to the acquisition of Shraddha, what is Shraddha? These are the points where the conversation will go in the next discussion. So, I'll leave it at that. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Shyam.
Thank you for the class.